Megan was asking me what prompted me to write the book. And, well, there were several things. How many of you here have been involved in something personally, something that you know something about directly, and then you've read about it in a newspaper? Have you ever had that experience, reading a story? And how accurate do you normally find what you read in the story? I can tell I'm not the only person in the world who's had this experience. And so much of what people just accept in everyday life is just wrong in many cases. I mean, leaving aside the question of opinions, and having sort of studied and more recently sort of taught and researched in transport for a number of years, I've heard so many of these sort of urban myths that I decided I had to do something about it. So one of you'll see at the start of the book, there are 10 questions that are designed to test how many of these myths have influenced you in your thinking. So one of them, for example, is what happened to petrol duty between the year 2000 and 2012. So it was before we got into the latest round of big cuts in it. What happened over those 12 years? How many of you would guess that it actually went down by 16%? How many of you knew, for example, that the number of people who commute by tram in Manchester, or the proportion, is 1.4% of commuters? And that's not because the trams are not well used, but you'll see the relevance of that when you come to that particular chapter in the book. So there are a number of myths that are sort of commonly believed by the general public, and there are some which I even hear sort of told to each other by professionals. And one of them is this idea that was doing the rounds, particularly a few years ago, and has had a big influence on government policy, the idea that somehow we were building too many flats. How many people heard all those stories about, unsold blocks of flats and how we had a shortage of family housing? Well, if you believe any of that, again, read the chapter of the book. So the first part of it is all about myth busting, and the second part is about solutions. When I was doing my PhD from 2005 to 2009, I came into this relatively late in life. I was very lucky, really, to be able to take 3 summers off doing kind of research. I spent probably in total about 6 or 7 months cycling 5,000 miles across 7 different countries, visiting cities which have been particularly successful in taming the effect of traffic and improving this sort of urban environment. And when I came home after each of those journeys, I had this sort of mixture of enthusiasm and frustration. And I see some of you have probably had similar experiences. And one of the key things that I sort of felt was, look, actually there's no rocket science in any of this. There is nothing that I have seen in any of these cities that could not be applied in British cities. Now, if you ever read some of these sort of best practice case studies, there's almost like an industry of this stuff. And if you look online, things like, anybody ever looked at things like the ELTIS website, which is run by the European Union, eltis.eu, and you ever read any of those case studies? And you start off with this view that says, isn't life the sun always shines in these places, doesn't it? Nothing ever goes wrong. And I realised that part of this sort of urge to come back and say, here's fantastic experience, look at this, isn't it wonderful, look at what they're doing in these other countries, can actually be counterproductive. Because in some cases it's actually helped to perpetuate another set of myths, the idea that sort of everybody over the other side of the channel is born with the sustainable transport gene, and that's why, of course, we can never do any of that stuff over here. Now, when you actually start digging into the history of how those cities and those countries came to do what they have done, you realise that's total rubbish. And in many cases, they suffered a lot of the aggravation and a lot of the problems that we suffer or would suffer if we were attempting to do similar things here. Now, of course, there are differences. There are differences of the way in which cities in some of those other countries are governed, which can only really be changed at a national level. But the critical differences, I find, typically come down to political will. And that's what a lot of the second part of the book is about. The last two chapters try to draw that together and say, okay, what should we be doing? And I don't claim that I've got all the right answers here. It's deliberately not an academic book, right? It's been written, and Neil, who edited it for UIT, was very kind of insistent on this. You know, literally, we went through line by line, comma by comma, every single point, you know, and he took the view, I know nothing, and if I can't understand this, neither will the readers. So it's all written in absolutely plain English, but you'll find at the back hundreds of references to sources, most of which are available online. So if you don't agree with my interpretation of it or the conclusions I draw, I invite people to go and have a look yourself. So the penultimate chapter talks about, okay, what can we and should we be doing? And then the final chapter is called What Can I Do? And it looks at that issue from three different perspectives. From the perspective of transport planners, you know, people who are actually sort of working in the profession. And I've had the interesting experience several times in the past of people who wanted to talk to me about things, particularly when I was a campaigner, really putting their neck on the line and saying, look, this is confidential, this is off the record, I'm not saying this to you. And so I thought it would be interesting to try and seek the views of some of those people, some of which you will read in that final chapter. So there's a bit about campaigning, a bit of my own experience, and some of the cities that I've used as case studies. People have been campaigning there, including Chris there, one from Brighton. And then the final part was about walking the talk in everyday life. Because two of the decisions which I took about 10 years ago now, when I really started getting seriously involved in this, one was to stop flying, and the other took a little bit longer, was to give up the car. And so there is an element of sort of personal reflection about what is involved in doing that and the way in which that can or cannot contribute to some of the solutions. So that, in a nutshell, is what the book is about. I hope you enjoy it. If you do, buy it and read it. It's available on the table over there. And apart from that, I would just say enjoy the rest of the evening, enjoy the wine, and make sure that we don't go home leaving food. Did anybody want to?
Does anyone have any questions?
Or to?
Or have you already been quizzing?
Start a very brief debate, if we.
In light of the recent change in policy on environmental issues and diesel cars, if in the what can I do vein, if you don't feel able to give up your car, what type of car should you be driving? Is there mileage in electric and hybrid?
Yes, in fact, there's a section you'll see about electric cars. I've changed my view on this over the years. I've always been sceptical about, and I'm still sceptical of the idea that electric cars are a panacea. They're not, for a whole bunch of reasons. But I don't think we will be able to meet our carbon emission targets without them. So yeah, if you are able to make that decision, and you can't do without the car and join a car club or something, then I would think electric would be best.
Can I ask a related question about your views on trams or reserved ways or buses versus cars? I had a meeting with the Local Enterprise Partnership Transport Subcommittee in Oxford, Oxfordshire, a couple of days ago. And it was interesting that the chairman said, well, in Oxford, we're developing driverless cars, and this will be the answer. So it's actually retrograde, just think about steel wheels on steel rails. Now, I couldn't understand myself, A, how one would get all these electric driverless cars through the roundabouts, but B, how one would generate all the energy needed unless we go for the sort of program of atomic power that's achieved in France. So I'd be very interested in your views about whether people are chasing a complete fanciful notion and thinking that we're all going to be driving around, or not even driving in robotic cars in places like Oxford or Cambridge.
Yeah, there is a brief kind of discussion of that at the end, and yeah, I mean, the first thing is to say, is that I think you probably agree, is that there's a lot of hype here. This ain't going to happen anytime soon. Right? There are going to be lots of new technologies which will come in gradually in terms of taking functions away from drivers, but none of that is going to make any significant difference until you get to the point where virtually everything is moving autonomously. And even then, it will only make a big difference if drivers essentially are willing to cease to be drivers. In other words, they're willing to give up that freedom to override the controls and make their own decisions. Now, whether that will happen, or whether what will happen in practice is that people will still prefer, given the choice, to take the controls, in which case the idea that it's going to generate some sort of revolution in our cities and so on is unfortunately not true. So to me that sounds a very strange argument for saying we don't want things like trams. There is some discussion there about the pros and cons of trams versus guided buses, and talks about the Cambridge one, which is actually one of the better examples, but I think, as I say at one point, that it gives ammunition to both sides, really. There are some aspects of that with the Cambridge busway which actually worked better than people expected. But, I mean, one of the key things I find about trams, right, is that the biggest difference they make is actually not to do with the people getting on the trams. If you, paradoxically, the people imagine that, okay, if trams make a big difference to transport, it's because people stop driving and choose to use the tram instead. Those numbers are so tiny that it will never make a significant difference to transport in cities as a whole. But one of the reasons why trams do in the cities where they have been introduced have in many cases made a big difference is because it forces the transport planners and the highway engineers to make some of the difficult decisions that they would rather avoid in terms of taking out road space. So in cities like Lyon, which have gone really big style in for tram building, right, you'll see that they have done relatively well in reducing the amount of car driving. Not because public transport has gone up very much, but because people have now walk and cycle far more than they used to, because capacity has been taken away from motor vehicles. And so I think that's actually a difficult one to sell to a highways engineer, but that's actually one of the strongest arguments for saying we should favour trams over things like guided buses.
As a cyclist, I'm very aware of any additional weight I've got on my vehicle is going to slow me down. A lot of electric cars are cars powered by electricity. Is there any sort of movement to try and get the sort of payload to weight of the vehicle ratio more sensible? Are you starting from, not from the starting point of view of a big heavy car, but a different kind of electric vehicle?
I'm not an expert on the technology, but I do know that question has been sort of clocked. There was our university is involved in sort of one of these sort of forward-looking research projects, looking at the longer-term implications of autonomous vehicles. And I know as part of that general sort of initiative, the European Union are looking at precisely that question. Is there a role? Is there an opportunity for some sort of intermediate type of vehicle? Yeah, it might be for more sort of shorter distances than a conventional car, and might be lighter and less energy consuming.
It seems fairly obvious that if you ask somebody to give up their car for one whole day a week, it will reduce their car usage, their mileage and everything else by 20%. It's a hell of a lot. That really is a lot to make difference. But how do we avoid the polarisation between car is bad, I'm not giving up my car, thank you very much, lobbies?
Wow, there's no one answer to that. I mean, one of the hopeful things is, I don't know how many of you have come across this phrase peak car before, the idea that what has happened, it's something which is happening internationally, that at some point, the date varies from different countries, but basically from about the Second World War onwards in most developed countries, car driving and traffic and car ownership was going up and up and up inexorably. And then at some point, about 10 years ago, for reasons that people are still arguing about, it stopped. And in some countries, like Britain, it's starting to come down. It's that sort of has come down very slightly. That sort of broad picture is actually made up of two conflicting tendencies. What's happening is that car ownership and use is going down in cities, but is continuing to rise elsewhere. So one of the important things that we need to do is to make sure, because we've got massive population growth happening in Britain, which is going to transform this country over the next sort of 50, 60 years or whatever. One of the key things is making sure that that population growth goes into the cities where people already own fewer cars. We know that has worked, and there's some evidence on that in the book. The idea that somehow that wouldn't work because people would, if people's preferences, they'll still carry on driving anyway, that has been proved to be wrong. Right. So we have a choice there. Are we going to concentrate growth of people in those places where people do drive, or in those places where they don't?
Does size matter? So what's the ideal city size?
Yes, it does, and you'll see a graph in the book that shows that. And if you are, well, certainly if you look at the British evidence, the answer is the bigger the better. The graph is continuous from, people drive most in rural areas, they drive least in London, and the graph goes like that in between. Having said that, some of the examples of the best practice cities that I show, places like Groningen, Freiburg, even Cambridge, are relatively smaller. So, Cambridge is 125,000, Freiburg is 220,000. So it is possible to have much more sustainable patterns in that size of city. What I think is going to be an absolute environmental disaster is the programme for what's called garden cities, right? The idea that building these small freestanding new settlements, actually I was going to say, Nick will be smiling here, because
Really opposite to what we're
slightly different, right, which is about ways of growing cities, but the idea that we can create separate new developments which are small in size will be an environmental disaster.
Two questions or comments. First, a comment. In addition to Stephen, in addition to being one of the clearest thinkers on sustainable transport that I know, he runs a really excellent master's in transport planning in UWE in Bristol. And that we know because our son has benefited very much from the course. The sting in the tail is a question. I looked through the chapter headings. Nothing on the wider social context, an economic context that affects transport. I'm thinking of like an employment policy which is increasingly towards short-term work contracts and implications of that for commuting trips as people don't move nearer to where they work and therefore generate longer journeys more likely by car. Have you dealt with such wider contextual factors or just too much?
Yeah, I mean, there are some references to some of those things, but that particular point about short-term contracts, no, I haven't got into that. And it sounds like it would be a very interesting subject to explore. Obviously, with a book that's trying to summarise all of this stuff in 220 pages, we do have to be a little bit selective. But yeah, I mean, there is the general point is very much in there that you cannot view transport separately from broader trends in society as a whole.
Do you think that organizations such as SASTRA's Global Cycling Campaign are focusing too much into cycling to solve the transport issue and not on an integrated approach that involves also other sustainable modes of transport such as hybrid buses or other forms of transport?
I mean, as SUSTRANS's main aim is about promoting active travel, and in a sense, if we want public transport improvements, they're going to have to come from government and local government. I don't think that NGOs can do an awful lot about that. But the other point is that when you compare practice in British cities with particularly the best practice places I've seen in Europe, it's not public transport where we're falling down. The biggest differences are in the rates of walking and cycling.
And is there a kind of a limit to the amount of cycling that cycling can give to the transport mix, or is there a point at which it tops out?
That's a very interesting question that we are nowhere near knowing the answer to, because at the moment the rates are so small. I mean, obviously the terrain has an influence, obviously, although I would argue with the growth of electric bikes, that's probably becoming less important. So, what's the potential with including electric bikes? Well, we don't know that yet. I mean, in places like Groningen, it's, like 35% of all journeys. In London today, there's a lot of hype about cycling growth in London, but it's still only about 2% of all trips. So, that's how much.
I thought it had gone up from 3 to 6.
No, London-wide.
It's gone up by share from about 1.2 to about 2.6. Can I just say that, I mean, all this stuff is, I think we really do need to get a lot meatier, and a lot of what I liked about the book is that you are sort of getting back down to the car question. I really do think that people need to say, it's not our job to try and offer nice solutions, it's our job to actually say we have a big mass car problem for a load of reasons. I know you couldn't go into the safety issues, the cultural, ideological issues in the book, but we really need to talk about seeing the car as a problem and putting restrictions. And that sort of part of it, the stick part, has sort of gone out of the picture since the loss of the Road Traffic Reduction Act in the 90s. And what I like about the book is that it's pushing it in that direction, saying it's not just one solution, you have a variety of solutions, and they all involve things like taking away space from cars. I also happen to be a believer in law enforcement, increasing the cost of petrol, all these things, they really need to be done. It troubles me that the kind of sustainable transport people tend to be a bit wimpish. Aren't they wimpish?
I mean, yes, I would, I would tend to at least partially agree with that. I mean, I can understand the urge to try and take the path of least resistance. In other words, and there's a couple of places where the book is saying, look, there are some things, a massive hike in petrol taxes would be a really good thing on so many different levels, but realistically, for as long as most people own cars and people vote, that's not going to happen. So, we then have to say, okay, what else can we do? And, so that's why quite a bit of the emphasis is on physical restraint. Things like filtered permeability, this principle that you can redesign your city and your streets to make it easy, quick and direct to travel on foot, by bike, or by public transport, and you can make it circuitous to travel by car. I think it's easier to get those sorts of changes in because everybody can see the whole environment improves, the places where people live improve. It's easier to get that sort of thing than it is to say, right, we're going to double petrol cost tomorrow.
Has anything been done about desire? For example, looking at why people like driving, what's the pull of it, and then transferring the desire somewhere else?
There is a massive literature on that. If you are interested, Tony's already given a plug for our master's course at UWE. We do a module called Changing Travel Behaviour that goes deep into the psychology of that, and you'll be very welcome.
Thank you.
I don't know, how long do people want to keep this discussion going for, or should we kind of carry on while we're drinking? Yeah, last one then.
Did you sense a different approach towards the car or other kinds of transport across those countries? Or a different feeling towards the car and other transport?
Honestly, not very greatly, no, in terms of the general public and certainly the media, for example. I mean, Freiburg, which is one of the cities that I show that's done really great things on this, has got a vicious right-wing media that bashes, Vauban, the car-free districts. The whole chapter about car-free development, it talks about the car-free districts. Well, the press that they've had from their local media is very similar to what you'd expect, from the Daily Mail over here. So there is a difference that I've noticed, very big differences in attitudes to cycling. Obviously, particularly in the Netherlands and Denmark to some extent, but attitudes to the car, no, people regard the car as king more or less everywhere.
Being a Dutch person, do you agree?
If what you're saying in terms of, Freiburg has got that sort of quite right wing, in Brighton got quite a backlash, or had quite a backlash against, the Green administration as it was used as a focus for the sort of the pro-car brigade to sort of really attack all sustainable transport. That we're sort of waiting to see what happens now. We've got a Labour administration, minority administration, and whether the sort of spin they put into their election materials actually will carry through, or whether they'll sort of settle back to pursuing sustainable transport measures as they did previously. But do you think, what's the chance that we can do what, say, Freiburg has done? And is it because in Freiburg they've got strong political leadership that is able to sort of see off this negative press and publicity? Because I don't get the feeling we're going to go anywhere fast in Brighton or anywhere else in the UK. And yet we both seem to be suffering similar things.
Yeah, again, there's no one answers that. Interestingly, one of the chapters is about Brighton and Cambridge, and one of the people who I interviewed there, and I've forgotten her name.
Jill Mitchell?
Jill Mitchell, yeah. She is on record in the book as saying, if we were in office, we would be doing similar things. Right? She's a Labour councillor, so this will be very interesting. Yeah, Brighton, for those of you who don't know, it was subjected to, the Green councillors were subject to really quite a degree of personal abuse, and there was a campaign financed by taxi companies and so on. And so much so that Ian Davey, who was one of the people I interviewed for that section, decided not to stand again, and he's gone off walking the coast path or something now, isn't he? Which I think is a great shame, because I think he was a good guy and actually was doing some positive things in Brighton.
Is that not an argument for keeping politics the hell out of it? Because if Freiburg has an extreme, right-wing, anti, whatever it is, anti or pro-car lobby, then, surely policy, yes, urban planning, yes, but actually,
I don't think you can ever...
Or try and just say this is an all-party issue.
Yeah, I don't think you can keep politics out of it, because it is by its nature a political issue, but one of the differences I noticed in Cambridge is that Cambridge has been relatively consensual. The officers have, certainly by comparison to things like Brighton, the officers have largely determined the transport policy over there, and it has not really featured as a major sort of issue of political change between the parties. Now, the fly in the ointment, potential fly in the ointment there is Cambridgeshire is UKIP, who for the first time are getting people elected and do take a violently anti-sustainable transport stance. So we'll see. But in some ways, it may get, the Cambridge model is maybe a bit easier than the Brighton model, I don't know.